This episode is sponsored by Wix Studio.
When is the last time you listened to a podcast about web development, web design, and small business and didn't fall asleep? Yes, we cover web development, web design, and small business, but like actual human beings with personalities. If you're a beginner, we're not going to talk over your head. It's more like asking your buddy for help. We have guests, we have fun, and let me tell you, these two can get off on a tangent. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to HTML All the Things Podcast. This is Matt Lawrence and Mike Curran.
That's right, everybody. We are back, and this is the episode. This is the HTML All the Things Podcast. This episode is titled, Why is Web Development a Cluster F***? So in this episode, we're going to talk about sort of why web development is, a huge disaster, but we're going to do so by going through the history of web development. We're going to talk about the early days of the web, even into as early as, say, the 1990s. We're going to talk about the early 2000s. We're going to talk about the first wave of JavaScript frameworks, single-page applications, SPAs, things like that, the current state of web development, and a whole bunch more. So, if this sounds interesting to you and you want to support the show, you can go and check us out on that Patreon, leave a review or rating on your podcast app, join us in our Discord server, or share this with your friends. And now, Mike, this is your episode. You wrote this. Please, take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just to kind of, web development is in a weird state right now where it is kind of a cluster, but I think the point of this episode is to outline, first of all, why. Obviously, that's the title. But I also will give you some good suggestions right at the end to avoid being bogged down by it. There's ways you can navigate through this and still become a really good developer. It's overwhelming to look at from a distance, but as you get closer to it, the cluster starts to kind of it starts to uncluster a little bit, and you start to kind of see the focus of some of these things, and you start to realize that 99% of it is just noise, and you can really get to a good state in web development. I just want to make sure that people that are just starting out understand that, yes, it is pretty intimidating to look at it right now, and you shouldn't feel bad that you're intimidated by it because of the situation that we're in. You should instead just kind of, I don't want to say power through because that defines that, there's no other way to do it. Just take it one step at a time. And again, I'll get into these kind of suggestions right at the end of the episode. But first, kind of the introduction to this. I have a meme here that I want to popularize. It's Barney Gumble during his weird alcoholic poem days, where he made a video for a movie contest or a movie festival or something like that. And in it, he's dying and sniffing a rose, and he says, "Don't cry for me, I'm already dead." And that's how web developers, I think, feel right now. That's where we're at as a web development industry. We're this is just especially when we start to analyze stuff. So if you ever have watched videos where they're comparing frameworks, or videos where they're extrapolating out a web development tech stack, and it just becomes this graph of insanity, and especially the dependency graphs. If you've ever seen a dependency graph where it actually graphs not only what your core libraries that you're using, but also the dependencies of those core libraries, it's like a maniac's entire basement covered in freaking bubbles and windows and just crap everywhere. It's chaos. The dependency graph for web development is unaltered chaos. Okay, so again, don't cry for me. I'm already dead. I'm in this. I'm dead. All right, but web development is known for being convoluted, right? In terms of different technologies that solve a million different problems in the same way. This leads to extreme confusion for new developers, especially when they're trying to learn and get into it, looking at it from a distance, watching videos, trying to get a job in the industry. Extreme confusion. I've talked to many developers that have just been essentially bounced out because of this. For senior developers, so at this point, I think I can consider myself as a senior developer. Maybe let's just say that. We were kind of raised in the darkness, like the Bane meme. We went through the start of this when stuff was more concise and a little bit more loose and less convoluted, I want to say. but like still very robust. Like, you still were able to build websites in the, 2000s, late 2000s and late 2010s or early 2010s. There was just like more like concrete ways of doing it, right? And there was still a lot of issues, and that's why a lot of these frameworks are built out, because to solve those issues. But the roadmaps at that time were a lot more clear. I just want to say that. And so as I grew as a developer, that's when this like insanity has started to happen. So I started before the insanity, and I was there during it and probably participated in creating it. And now I'm at the end of it. So as a senior developer, I kind of understand all the little separate pieces and why they're there and what they're putting together. So I have a very different perspective than someone first starting out. And I think a lot of, again, senior developers have that same kind of maybe rose-colored glasses on, like when they're really opinionated and very happy with their stacks and all that. And like I tend to be pretty opinionated on my SvelteKit stuff and, Tailwind and all that. Like I love that stuff. We put these rose-colored glasses on because we know the problems that it solves. We were there when the problems were written. I don't know why I'm talking in memes right now, but we were there at the start, and like we kind of rose through it and are just like using frameworks and libraries that are solving these problems that we had 10 years ago and not even thinking about it, and just being like, okay, well, we did it. We wrote it ourselves before. Now we can just use a framework or a library that does it for us. Like, that's great. But again, for someone coming in that did not have that experience, it's very daunting, right? They start to ask 5 million questions. Do you dive into HTML, CSS, JavaScript, or do you go straight to React? That's a very common question at this point. Do you have to know Webpack before even starting React? I think, Matt, you had that. You kind of that was a blocker for you for a while.
I kept hearing like people would just like bring up Webpack, like, oh, this is Webpack, that's Webpack. But I would never hear the same description. I would always hear Webpack talked about like as if you were in another room. You explained what you were doing with it or what it does, and then you would, you would come back out and just like talk to everybody about it, like as if they were in the other room as well. And it reminds me of, honestly, it reminds me of a lot of tweets or X posts where people are talking about something and you just haven't seen the first half of the conversation. Or if like an influencer is talking to their followers, their dedicated followers that are aware of something that happened to them or happened in their community, and they're just sort of posting to like everybody on X, but you have no idea what they're talking about. It's like that. That's what Webpack is to me. I know you've explained it to me and I've since forgotten it, and that's how it is still to this day.
Yeah, and that in itself is kind of intimidating when you're using tools that you don't fully understand. And a lot of times when you're learning web development, you'll go through a tutorial and they'll be like, just use this tool. You don't have to fully understand it. That's literally the advice that you get, or that's the teachings that you get. And in fact, like myself, I'm like, I kind of teach that as well, where I'm just like, hey, we're using Vite for SvelteKit. Don't dive into Vite and try to figure it out from the ground up. But the reality is that that causes issues as well, where if you don't understand what the tool does, how to use the tool, and you're just kind of putting in a CLI command, getting an output and just running with it, if anything ever goes wrong, you're kind of screwed. You're kind of screwed. And then again, that's another thing, like debugging the web development in itself is kind of a disaster.
I'd like to actually say something here as well.
Anyway,
anyone who's listening right now who has done or currently does the IT for their parents or their family members, and specifically for family members that are very much not tech savvy, you get things set up for them, but you get things set up for them in a very particular way. So you get it. So it's like, okay, the DVD player is on input 1, and, you click the input button once to get there. And then if you want to go to, satellite, you click on input again, and that's it. But, one day something happens where the HDMI cable comes loose, or the TV updates, and now the input menu is different, where there's now, 2 inputs, but also some sort of streaming service, which is actually very common, where it'll have like a free TV, IPTV, whatever streaming service with ads and all the rest of it. Like Samsung Free is an example of one of those. Pluto TV, another example. And now it's no longer 1 click, 2 click. It's 1 click, 2 click. Oh, hang on, what's this Pluto thing? And like they're done. Like they never understood that there are set-top boxes that are plugged into the inputs into the back of the TV. And so to us, like to me, the people doing the IT, we're able to go, oh, well, there's just another input, and that other input, quote unquote, is another set-top box, quote unquote, but it's just like a replacement for sort of like TV back in the day. It's just IPTV, and that's why they're putting that there. And the other inputs go to literal hardware inputs. They go to the HDMI. Let's relate that back to web development in that web development feels like you're that person that is getting helped. You're the person that doesn't understand that there's two HDMI physical inputs and that the TV updated from the internet and that the TV got, this extra thing. That's what web development feels like a lot of the time when you're using countless tools and not understanding what is going on. And that, like, realistically speaking, is really scary because it really, like, you're the developer here. Like, you're the developer. And if you're just learning, you're not going to understand everything. And fair enough. But, we're kind of getting to a point where it's like, okay, like we're getting so many things on our plate. We'll just use Vite, all the time, every time. I don't really know what Vite does, but like the internal intranet wiki says to run this command on Vite. So I'm going to do that. And boom, and now I'm off to the races. One day it says, fail, error, whatever. And you're like, I actually don't know what Vite was. Whereas the people who do understand it, if we bring it back to the TV example, would, some reason one of these HDMI inputs isn't working. Let's check the cables. Let's check the power cables to the set-top boxes, right? Like there's a troubleshooting step there because there's an understanding of what's connected and why and where it's connected. Whereas there's a lot of, people that are like technician, quote unquote, level, where you are doing the developing, like you're the techie on site, but you're unaware of a lot. Not everyone's aware of everything. And I know that's an argument that people will have, like, not everyone knows everything. If you call up Bell here in Canada, which is a telecom company, and you get them to fix your home phone, that person that comes in doesn't understand everything. Like they don't understand IP phone. They don't understand. They're given a set of steps. So they don't understand everything. And I fully acknowledge that. But they have a framework of people where they go, they check their 8 areas they're supposed to check. And then they go, okay, I don't know. We got to call up. We got to escalate this. We got to get another type of tech in here. There's a way to that. Whereas web devs, sure, we have Google, but I mean, now we're learning it from scratch again. Like we're going in and being like, what is Vite? Oh, it's this. Cool. Well, what was I using it for? Because, chances are whatever tool it is, if we, leave Vite and we talk about anything else, has like 100 uses or like 1,000 features. And I have that argument with customers all the time where someone will ask me a question and I don't have an answer. And I kind of get scoffed at like, oh, do you even know what you're doing? And I was like, there's over 1,000 settings, in this CMS, in this framework, in this whatever. There's over 1,000. I use multiple no-code tools. I use coding tools. I use a mix of both. I can't remember all the JavaScript methods. I can't remember all this, that. I can't remember what the HD access was, what, like for your specific site. I mean, like, I don't remember what I set your HD access to. Like, is it handling the redirects? Is the redirects being handled by WordPress? I can't remember. And I know to some clients that looks like, this guy doesn't really know what he's doing. But unfortunately, web development, and we're going to talk about this right now, is not a well-oiled machine. It's not a well-oiled machine, and there's a lot of parts where you just, I don't know what's going on. And I that's it. I don't know what's going on, and if I go to the developer beside me, there's a good chance that they're not going to know what's going on.
Yep, exactly. And that's the kind of reality that we live in right now. So as web developers, like, as you start to become more senior, as you start to, discover more and more issues and dive deeper, you'll start to understand more, but you'll never understand everything in web development. It's just not possible. There's too many different areas. And I think that's okay. At least at where we're at in web development, you have to be able to accept that you will never understand everything. Otherwise, you'll burn out. Like you'll just flat out burn out. There's no way you can do that. You need to, understand things deeply. You need to understand what your core competencies are. You need to understand what you're working on currently. But to then like go out of that box and just be like, well, I'm just going to, understand every part of Vite just for shits and giggles, even though I'm only using one part. Like it's not realistic. Like there's so many things you have to understand if you're using like Svelte or SvelteKit. You have to go pretty deep into that. And then you have to understand the back end. You have to go deep into that. Like you just can't take everything on. And it takes a while for that mindset to change in people, to accept that what really drives that is like when they're just under pressure to just complete features. And then they just drop everything and just try to complete the features. And that's really the best way to learn. That's why we, suggest project-based learning. Again, at the end of this episode, we're going to talk about that. But it wasn't always like this. Web development wasn't always like this. And that's why I want to kind of go through a little bit. I'm not going to go too deep into the history of web development, but I do want to kind of get to the point where like, what caused this? Or like, why did we get to this point? And really, you have to kind of understand the history a little bit. In the early days of the web, 1990s, we're talking about, there really was the fundamental concepts of web development, HTML, CSS, and a very small subset of JavaScript that we see today. Most sites were static sites. I would say most sites were hosted on stuff like Apache. I don't know if there's any other competitors at that time, but let's just say that, Apache is the thing that people were hosting most sites on. So there was barely any data ingesting, or like APIs weren't really a thing at that time. So to host a website was literally like, hey, do you have a server? Look at the file structure of that server using like something like FTP, drop your files on there, and then point a DNS name to it, right? So you have to understand a little bit of server architecture. Servers were a thing, and you had to be much more aligned with how a server works and how DNS works to a certain degree a lot more. But in terms of like frameworks or like JavaScript tooling, there was nothing. Like it was just like a script file. There's no linters, nothing. So in that sense, it was a lot simpler. Now, obviously, like styling a website was very convoluted, pretty much a disaster at that time. Like there was no Flexbox, obviously. The box model was like barely understood at that time. Like most of it was like a lot of websites were just built with tables, for instance. Like tables was a big thing back then, because you could do so much with the table that you couldn't with the box model at the time. So there was a lot of limitations. And this is key to understand, that old web development had tons of limitations that people had to either work around or accept and move on, right? It was easy to develop, sure, to a certain degree, but as soon as you got out of that like comfort zone of just putting some information on a page and you wanted to design
what's
something.
A little bit sad here is that this era really, it was the golden potential era for like having your HTML be super concise and super sort of structured, I guess. Everything labeled properly, we're not nesting a million things in each other and stuff like that. But then tables comes around, which is supposed to be for data. And it's like, well, we're just going to lay everything in the tables. And it's like already, like we're in the infancy here, and we're already taking something to use in something else that's not designed for. And so like computers, like right now, SEO wise, whatever you want to say, accessibility wise as well, tables are supposed to be used for laying out data, right? More or less. If you have a big old bunch of data, literally that's supposed to be in a table, I mean, that you should use a table. And then the HTML structure, meaning the HTML tag table, lets the computer know, or lets the reader know, the accessibility reader, no, this is a data table, and there's going to be some data in there. But like, we're in the beginning, and we've already thrown this out the window.
Yeah, that's how we started, and that's where we went. But yeah, so that's what happened with the 1990s. Everything was a kind of client-facing static websites. Late 1990s, early 2000s was the rise of the server-side technologies. This is when we're like, well, wait, we can do a lot more, and like so many people have access to the web now. Maybe we should just open up some functionality. Like people should be able to enter a form and submit data and show like scores of games or something like that, or statistics of hockey players and like whatever. Like there was just like a lot of interesting implementations that people thought of with this new accessible technology. And that gave to the rise of backend stuff like PHP, ASP, JSP, a lot of dynamic websites, but were more like leaning again on the backend server-side scripting. So a lot of like the HTML was essentially structured on the back end and then served as an HTML file to the front end with some JavaScript and CSS, right? So like everything was done in the back end where people were more comfortable at that time, because there was no really, the front end wasn't a thing as much back then, especially like front end developers weren't huge back then. It was a lot of back end devs that were like, obviously some UI developers for like C# and Windows, like Mac OS. Like there was a lot of mobile, not mobile devs, but a lot of like native OS developers, but there wasn't any front end web developers really at that time. A lot of back end developers were creating these technologies to make the front end more dynamic. And with that, the emergence of databases for the web came out, like MySQL for content management. Again, like a little bit of that CMS structure was put in place to be able to manage your data using databases and a kind of an admin dashboard built on the back end. And a really popular stack came to play. This is like the first, at least, web development mention of a stack, the LAMP stack. This is a very popular stack that would probably still one of the most popular ones around. It's what something like WordPress is still hosted on, but it's called the LAMP stack. It's Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. The PHP is a little bit contested. Some people are saying that it could be PHP, Python, Perl, like any of the P programming languages. I don't think that's it.
Well, it's PHP because
that was what it was
back in the day, and still to this day, many hosts, meaning hosting companies, that's what you buy. Like you're buying a cPanel environment, and that's what it comes out of the box with. Yes, you can configure things, and some of them let you install your own whatever, but many of the sort of like, yo, I want to just sort of plug and play with this $3 a month shared hosting, it's LAMP.
Absolutely. So again, I would say that this was still fairly simple. Now, again, you needed to know server management, Linux. So you needed to know Apache. Like you're the one that needed to be setting these things up at that time, right? Like hosts could barely do it for you or couldn't do it for you really at that time. You were in charge of the entire stack and had to either have a company where, you had server admin, database experts for MySQL and backend developers and a little bit of front end, like designers and UX, UI developers and stuff like that. You had to have all that kind of together to build a full stack website, or you just have to be that developer that knows everything, which there was quite a few of those as well. So that's still a simple thing, but you're starting to understand that like, hey, there's a stack now. They're trying to optimize things. They're trying to standardize a little bit on the stack. It's trying to make it a little bit easier for people to like build a full stack web application. What happened next was like, hey, there's a lot we can do on this back end, but why don't we shift some things to the front end? Like, why don't we start dynamically rendering, like JavaScript is a language, like it's a programming language. Why don't we start like utilizing that language more and start dynamically rendering data straight from a back end right on the front end instead of compiling that data, like putting it all together in an HTML and then serving that on the front end every time a database changes, right? Or every time a user hits your website, you put stuff to the front. So mid 2000s, you have stuff like Ajax revolutionizing interactivity and responsiveness. You have stuff like jQuery coming out, which a lot of developers know, it's still being used pretty heavily, but it allows for a lot easier DOM manipulation. Now, DOM is, again, the kind of core infrastructure of a website. It would be if you want to target a div on a page and change that div, you're manipulating the DOM. If you want to target a button on the page and add an event listener to that button, you're manipulating the DOM of the web page. And jQuery made it so that you could do it in a much less verbose way. Like, you could still do it with JavaScript. It was just very verbose and very convoluted, and you had to solve for a lot of edge cases. jQuery was a framework that came and made it so that it was just like a lot easier to write. You got frameworks built on top of it called Prototype, MooTools. I just learned about MooTools recently. Apparently, this is a huge thing. Have
Only
you heard
in
about
name.
MooTools, Matt? So you've heard about it. Yeah, it's apparently like a jQuery thing, like a similar thing to jQuery. Yeah, so like you just get, now you got iterations on jQuery essentially at that time. And this was like the start of that, like, well, I can do this better. I can do it differently. I see the issues with jQuery. It's too big or too small. Like you just had people coming out of the woodwork trying to solve the problem that's already been solved in a better way. And I want to be clear here that I'm not saying that's a bad thing. In the early days, or even in later days, you want people to continue to push innovation. And the only way to really do that is with competitive tools and people's opinions. Has it gotten to the point where it's a little bit too much? Sure. Yes. I think we've gotten to the point where it's a little bit too easy to build these tools almost. And so it's democratized a lot of people to come in and make better tools that they will like, I quote unquote better tools that they think are better. Again, sometimes they're worse. Sometimes they're better in certain ways, but worse in other ways. There's always kind of a trade-off. And that's kind of propelled it, but that'll be a little bit later. The next thing that happens after like the jQueryfication of the web is in the late 2000s, early 2010s, we all of a sudden see like with the power of the JavaScript, now we can create single page applications. Like, why do we need these native applications? Like, why do we need to build everything in C# or C+? Or like Java, whatever, and have all that logic in Java and host it on the back end and tons of processing? Why don't we shift all that to the web, right? Like, why don't we do like a to-do list on the web, like the fully on the web? No, like just connected to a backend middleware layer for like secure connection, but no logic there. It's just like a database middleware layer. And all the actual logic, like adding a to-do and all that, will just be hosted right on the front end. Like it'll just appear right away when you press it. If you get super efficient, no, like less database calls, less back and forth, less rendering, everything's happening on the front. And with that came an explosion again of frameworks, Backbone.js, Angular.js, to make it easier to create these SPAs, single page applications. The focus went from server side very deeply to very deep client side rendering. And then obviously modular code on top of that to be able to componentize it. This is like the maturing of the web.
You know, you were just talking about the simplicity or the ease of like making your own frameworks, making your own tooling, kind of coming into, I guess, maturity in a way in this era. And the very first thing I thought when you said that was it's very easy, because you were just showing me some stuff. It's very easy to make your own GPT. And we're talking about the infancy, quite literally, of AI as we know it, these sort of chat models, whatever you want to call them. And so, like, are we gonna see this also in the chat era, in the AI era, of everyone being like, no, I think this is better. No, I think this is better. But now it's so easy that we're doing it. I understand, you know, having your own personal GPT is a different animal. But my mind immediately went there was, are we going to have somebody make, you know, a tool that's just a little more advanced than the GPT maker, editor, whatever you want to call it, when you're on your chat GPT, you get logged in? Are we going to see that where someone's going to be like, I have my own chatbot? No, I have my own chatbot. You have chat GPT. I have like web dev GPT, and like, you know, just a disaster of chatbots. Like, I know there's already competitors out there, but I am seriously curious if this is going to happen to AI as well, where it's like, oh, chat with it, interact with it. So it's going to ask you questions every time and blah, blah, blah. Super curious.
I mean, GPT wise, sure, but like, I don't know the real ramifications of that being too deep. The thing that's going to limit it from like exploding in a similar way to like the JavaScript framework ecosystem is the fact that if you want to create your own models, like if you're not just building on top of a model, the cost of that is like extremely prohibitive. So you've got to be VC funded. You've got to have just money to burn for a long time before you're profitable. Like that's a pretty significant limitation for most people. So from a grand perspective, like having, you know, millions of or hundreds or thousands of new models coming out, I hesitate to say I'm not going to see that because I feel like it's already happening. I'm just thinking right now because there's a bunch of small, like very specific models that are being generated for like, you know, checking your water pressures. That's a complete.
Well, I would like to say
stuff like that.
I would like to say
very
that
specific.
I don't know if it was water pressure, but I know somebody. Actually, Mike, we know somebody that is using something similar to that to check. I believe it is their water meter, and to monitor their water usage. But the thing is, like, you might think, well, that's, you know, easy enough. There's a sensor. This is done not via the sensor itself. This is done via a camera that is pointed at the sensor that reads the thing and understand, like it has an AI that understands what's going on and then does a whole bunch of stuff. It's not mega advanced, but obviously the town or the city is the person that owns the water meter. And so they don't have like, you know, a USB port you could just plug into and connect to a computer and then run the data. So we have I don't know if it's a GPT, whatever it is, but there's some sort of AI, quite literally an AI that is hooked up to a server machine that is hooked up to a camera that is pointing at this water meter that is then running all this data. And I would assume, because I don't know all the details, is running the data against a bunch of other people to then determine probably water like efficiency. We shouldn't run the dishwasher till 6 p.m. Things like that. Devs, this one's for you.
I've got 30 seconds to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things you can do in 30 seconds or less on Studio. Integrate, extend, and write custom scripts in a VS Code-based IDE. Leverage zero setup dev, test, and production environments. Ship faster with an AI code assistant. And work with Wix headless APIs on any tech stack. Time's up, but the list keeps going. Step into Wix Studio and see for yourself. Link in the show description and in the show notes.
Yeah, exactly. Like that kind of stuff is going to be pretty prevalent, and small little, like, specialized stuff is probably going to be a lot more commoditized. So yeah, I mean, you're probably right. Stuff's going to happen. It's going to explode. But anyway, moving on. That was kind of like Angular backbone was the very beginning of this explosion. Right? That's when we realized that, oh, damn, like we could build anything on the web. Like it's not just like for, little websites and little web apps. We can build literally like Figma on the web. We can like Photoshop on the web. We can build full-on fledged, 100% fully hosted applications on the web. That was the mind shift at that time. Because before, again, a lot of people were thinking like you have to build those kinds of applications. You have to go native. You have to build them in like Objective-C for iOS or macOS, and like Java for Android, or like C# from Windows, like whatever. Like you have to go native to build an application. And now it's like, no, you don't. Like this JavaScript is evolving, and people's browsers are getting better, and people's computers are getting better, good enough that a web application can do everything that a native application can do. And so with that came an influx of people using Angular. And then in that influx, they're like, well, Angular sucks at accept whatever. Let's build better things. And then in the mid-2010s, you got React, Vue.js, which pretty much came out at the same time, by the way. Then you got Angular 2, which was an entire rewrite of Angular that people got extremely angry at. And there was a huge war in the Angular community, which is a very good theme of JavaScript frameworks. It's just anytime there's a change, there's going to be a war. And then out of that war probably came another 10 frameworks or something like that. And the growing ecosystem of frameworks also needed stuff to be able to like put frameworks together. Like frameworks have a lot of different components and a lot of different things. Like how do you optimize images in a framework? Like do you just write a script and have to go and check all your files and run that script through all your files? Like you can do that. You can still do that. But what happened is like, well, everyone's writing the script. Why don't we just make a standard for this? And that's where bundlers and package tools came along, right? Like Webpack and Babel, where they're like, well, if we want to optimize all images, why don't we just give that to everyone in a Webpack plugin? And then it'll just run through any framework and optimize all the images right away for you when you're building. So this is where bundlers came into play. It's not just optimize. I'm giving optimized images as like an example, but like they'll do like minification. They'll get your files ready for deployments. They'll make sure that your import statements all work when you're building files. Like an import, will just essentially tell the build tool to put that whatever you're importing into that file, and on build time, it'll put that into the file and make one big file with the import statement. And boom, you're sending that to the web, like as a JavaScript file with a bunch of imports, a bunch of like code in it that on your own machine, like in your IDE, wouldn't have been there because it was just an import statement. But again, build tools were designed to make it easier for you to do all this, to make your files cleaner, to make it easier for you to minify. And then like someone created Webpack, and obviously from that, people are like, well, Webpack sucks, and I'll get to the next part of it. But like other stuff came out of that. So again, another thing added to the JavaScript ecosystem to solve a problem that exists for sure because of the increase in usage in the JavaScript ecosystem. That's the theme. As the JavaScript ecosystem increases usage, as it can do more, it inherently starts being used and created more for it. And with that also came the rise of NPM. And this is where the explosion actually happens, realistically. A way for developers to be able to share, install, update, access a central library of packages. So all of these packages, React, Vue, Angular, everything plus all the libraries are going to be hosted on NPM at that time. And now, even now, where you can just go simply NPM install. That's a whole CLI process. Again, something that was developed just for web development, or like it developed and adapted for web development at the time, so that you could install these packages easily. And then that was plugged into like something like Webpack. This, again, as you can see, this complexity starts to balloon. Like as soon as you start getting these things, it starts to need more to simplify it. As I'm saying it, I'm hoping that you're understanding the progression, though. That's the point that I want to make with this history, is that this wasn't just like a overnight, like, boom, we need all these tools. This was a, because of this, we made this. Because of this, we made this. Because of this, we connected these two and made this. And that is happening infinitely now. It's gone to the point of just infinity, where every tool and another tool will be combined into making one tool, or a tool that connects two tools. And that, again, that continues and continues to go on. Next, what happened in the late 2010s and 2020s was TypeScript, type safety. What was the number one thing that people were complaining about with JavaScript? It's too loosey-goosey. You can't set types. You can't trust it in a big project because Jimmy over there can write, a variable that contains a string, and Brittany down the street can then assign a number to that variable and break the entire application, and nothing will be said in the compiler. You'll only figure it out when Billy uses the application and reports an error and tells you to, screw off because you broke his website. So again, a tool was built because this bullshit was happening with JavaScript to make it so that JavaScript was more type safe. But with that, you had to add TypeScript to your project, right? So you needed to, again, use the bundler tools that we had before to add TypeScript. Add a runtime for TypeScript in your IDE. That's another complexity on top of it. Have that working, have that crashing all the time, restarting it all the time. So that still is going on today. Like, it's fine. That's just how we live. We just restart TypeScript and move on. But that's where that came from, right? And then we got stuff like the Jamstack architecture, where you had a lot of API-driven stuff. JavaScript, API markup, like all that stuff. You got meta frameworks like Next.js, Nuxt.js, SvelteKit, or Sapper, I think it was at that time. You got these meta frameworks that would take you back to, when did I bring it up? The late 1990s and the early 2000s, back to server-side rendering, because people realized that in certain situations, server-side rendering is actually better than client-side rendering. So we shouldn't client-side render everything. Certain things we should server-side render. So now we have these combination frameworks where, like, you can client-side render certain things, you can server-side render other things. And again, that solves issues, that solves problems for large applications that need to solve these problems. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't simplify things, right? Like, it doesn't make things simple. It makes things much more complicated for the people that are trying to start web development, because now they have like, okay, so now not only do we have server-side rendering and client-side rendering, we have a smushing of the two, where now we have to like denote our files in different ways to say that this one runs on the server and this one runs on the client all in one project instead of separating them out. And yeah, like that it was not an easy concept to wrap your head around. Still, I would say is not an easy concept to wrap your head around, but it did open up some interesting some interesting use cases. And that's why it was built. It was built because people realized that you could do this. And for larger projects, it makes sense. And yeah, like that, it became a thing. So this is a little bit more loosey-goosey than before, but that's where we're getting to right now. With the creation of these meta frameworks comes the need to host them.
I'm so mad right now.
Like,
I'm so mad.
Hosting these meta frameworks isn't as simple as putting files on a server. Because of the smushiness of client and server here, and how like stuff runs on client and the server sometimes together, they have to be hosted in different ways. So now you have to have these like continuous integration, continuous deployment pipelines. You have to have containerization on how you kind of put it all together. So you can just make a container, like a Docker container, and put it on a server. So it's more like a file-based system. And then you slowly start to get to the point where, maybe we just commit to Git and then have something else take care of all that for us, right? Like, we're starting to get to that point where Vercel and Netlify are around, because we realize that this is too complicated. So we got to simplify it by adding another service that makes it so that it's simpler and obfuscates a lot of this. And that's another very common thing that happens, is like, we get to the point where it's too complicated. We add a service on top of that to obfuscate the complicated parts without giving you access to all the complicated parts. And again, that's where Vercel and Netlify come in. And yeah, now we're at the current state of web development where we have things called serverless, still has servers, of course, but they are on demand, where like you don't just have a server just always running your function. You have a server that's waiting for. This is hard to get through because I didn't realize how
Mike,
how
you
actually
sound
crazy this is.
like
but,
you're a tech expert on the show NCIS, and you're just sort of like gobbledygook talking about like, this is how we're tracking down the suspect for this murder. This is chaos.
And everything I've said is accurate. Like everything I've said is very accurate to what the situation
I do have a
is
question.
right now. So,
why would you do all this server-side rendering stuff in the way that you're talking, when if you were like, yo, we should try some server-side rendering, why wouldn't you use the old methods? Or the old method's bad? Or do we just not like the fact that they're old and we're like, why don't we just tape something else on here? We still have some duct tape left on the roll here.
So I'm trying to find the YouTube channel right now.
Is it Matt
okay.
is upset?
It's programmers are also human. As he would say, JavaScript is the answer to your question. And I would just leave it like at that.
I was going to say, you need to explain it to me, at least, Stephen off air here.
Yeah, at least to you. But essentially, because of the rise before of front-end SPA stuff and everyone coding in JavaScript at that time, and that brought like, I don't know how many, but like so many developers into the JavaScript ecosystem. And again, building those JavaScript toolings, that at the point when the JavaScript developers realized, I'm one of these, by the way, I'm raising my hand. I am a JavaScript developer, so I'm talking about myself. But at the point that one of these JavaScript developers realized this, that we need server-side rendering, instead of going back to the old ways, they're like, well, how do we bring JavaScript into this? And they brought JavaScript into it by stapling like Node.js, which is a JavaScript server runtime, to a front-end framework and having that all work nicely together in one package. Does that answer your question?
No. You know what feeling I'm getting right now, actually? I don't even know. I'm just going to describe how I'm feeling because I don't know what to say. When I go to some of these things, Node.js, whatever, I go to their marketing site specifically, and I read what they do, and I don't know what they're talking about, and I've been building websites for people for years. I understand a bunch of you, the listeners, are going to be like, Matt's an idiot. Fantastic. This is chaos. What is happening? Like, a marketing page is meant to be like, yo, this is what we do. This is what we're selling in its simplest form for someone who just so happened to stumble upon our site, because we have other pages for those that are enthusiasts of, enter in whatever it is here. And so they're going to go dive into the site, whereas you don't even know what's going on yet. You're just getting your bearings. The very fact that the getting your bearings part is already confusing proves that this is not good. This is crazy.
Yeah, crazy. But yeah, let's continue on.
That's what the industry does. I mean,
that's what JavaScript frameworks do. So again, the 2010s brought about the continual evolution of these new frameworks and the creation of new frameworks and libraries because of everything that I said before. And then also like, hey, we made all of these. Maybe we should go back a little bit and focus on performance, scalability, and the funny one here is developer experience. Developer experience became huge in the 2020s, if you remember, or if anyone remembers the developer advocate boom, all those tooling companies that all of a sudden became 1 billion. Like Vercel is $1 billion company. It hosts web development applications. It's $1 billion company. Developer tooling, experience, JavaScript. Anyway, it's developer experience. I believe it's meant to be good. And for me, again, as a JavaScript developer from the 2010s, I went through the fire and I appreciate a lot of these new tools that help me. But for a new developer, I don't believe the developer experience is very good. As like, the reason that I say that is because like, if we go to, again, not to pick on Vercel, but if we go to Vercel, their documentation is great. Their stuff is great. In the vertical of Vercel, sure, the developer experience is good, but the vertical of Vercel doesn't really account for the 20 other developer experience libraries and frameworks that you need to account for. So now you're like, sure, one of yours is good. Even if all 20 that you choose are amazing for a project, you still are going through 20 different developer experiences to put it all together. And that's where it kind of starts to go into this like JavaScript fatigue world, right? Like now we're in JavaScript fatigue. Like there's way too many tools and frameworks. There's tools being built out right now. And yeah, that's where we're at today. Like we're in JavaScript fatigue. As a JavaScript developer, I'm sorry to everyone listening, but the reality is that's where we're at, and there's no way back yet or ever. So we need to accept it and continue to build more JavaScript frameworks.
Are there people like exploring alternatives to JavaScript right now? Like, I mean, I'm sure there is some, but I mean, en masse or a large portion of people, are they like, we're JavaScript fatigue, let's either, I don't know, invent a new language or go back to something else? Like, because here's the thing is like people, it's a meme. People go like, oh, PHP is like a bad word, but it's so fast, it's so quick, it's so efficient, it's this, it's that, it's the other thing. And PHP is still being developed. I mean, PHP like versions go out of date rather quickly. I would say they go end of life like pretty quick in the grand scheme.
The problem is that PHP is not a web framework.
Yeah.
PHP is a back-end framework that still requires you to write in JavaScript.
Sure. I'm just using PHP as an example because it's something that's not JavaScript and it's older. And it's been around since the beginning.
One thing I do want to say is JavaScript is continually being developed and continually progressing into a more mature language. It was created very haphazardly, put together to get some scripting working on the front end, but it's becoming more mature from a base language perspective. There is, in my opinion, a time when we will probably see a much more robust JavaScript where we'll need to use less of the current tooling and less of the current frameworks and packages. I say less because we're still need to use some. And I say current because I'm sure that as we develop more there, someone will come in and be like, well, why don't we just use another whole set of frameworks that make it even better? And there's no stopping that. I'm losing my voice because this is just so insane. But there is no stopping that kind of progress because of the mass use of the web, not just by developers, but just by everyone. And the fact that we want to do more and more on the web than we are even today, right? Like the more we want to do on the web, the more these things are going to continue to be evolved and be convoluted and abstracted and become harder and et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I remember you were saying that Figma is an example of somebody that's really pushing the limits, because there's like, not only are you designing things in there, which is like a whole visual experience, which is already in the advanced side of web development, let's say, but also there's a bunch of collaboration tools in there, and there's a bunch of other things in there, like collaboration tools as in like live collaboration, visually speaking, not just, hey, this person's working on that, although that also exists. And there's a bunch more to Figma, obviously, that, there's a bunch of productivity things in there, and the list goes on and on. So that would be an example of something that would normally be, say, diverted to the desktop, because it's like, yo, make your computer compute this and only talk to the server when it needs to. Whereas this is like, I understand some's client, some server, but it's still a lot.
Yes. And to answer your question earlier, like replacing JavaScript, not really. There is no work in replacing JavaScript. There is work in not subsidizing, but having a more performant version, a more performant language running on the web, and not work, but it's already implemented. Yep. It's called WebAssembly. I believe you can write it in like Rust. You can write it in C. Like there's many ways you can write WebAssembly, but it's much more like to the core, to the metal of the operating system rather than just the browser. It still has the browser limitations. So for instance, like you mentioned, Figma uses a lot of WebAssembly to make it so that it can do the things that it can do, but it still has the limits of the browser, where like it could only have like 4 gigs allocated or something like that, right? Like it could only have a certain amount of RAM allocated to that tab. So it has to work around those limits, but it still has the performance of a more native application due to the WebAssembly side of things. Still uses a ton of JavaScript, to be fair, but like, in my opinion, JavaScript isn't going anywhere, probably for the next decade, 2 decades, 3 decades. So we need to accept where we're at right now. Where we're at right now is pretty chaotic. I don't see it getting much better. which is why I'm making
Is this
this
a
episode.
warning?
Because I think it's a warning, it's a realization, it's a way to move forward with this, right? Yes, saying it from start to end sounds kind of convoluted and crazy, and ingesting all of that all at once is a lot to go through. And like you said, it sounds like I'm talking nonsense in a CSI or NCIS show, and true, 100%. But I'm not. So like, this is the reality, so we have to kind of accept it.
Next thing you know, both of us are going to be using the same keyboard, just like in the show. Yeah, well, we need to hack the hacker faster, or whatever the heck they were doing.
We need to hack faster. Yeah. We need to type faster to hack it. Yeah, no, 100% agree. I was going to go into like a framework, tools, and library debates section here. I feel like I've gotten my point across. I don't think I need to do that. I might post some extra stuff, extra tidbits in the show notes about the debates. So maybe go and check out the show notes on htmlotherthings.com. I'm going to go straight into suggestions for not being overwhelmed, because I've achieved my goal of overwhelming you. Have I not? I won. Okay, so now, what can you do to still be productive, to still get into the JavaScript ecosystem? Focus on the fundamentals. We teach this from day one. Like, I'm pretty sure it's in the first 3 episodes that we ever did. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are not going anywhere. That's what all of these frameworks are built on, the front-end ones. If you know it well enough, it will help you understand the concepts of why all these frameworks exist, of what they do, of how they help you. And that's really key. It's not understanding fully how they work, because that's a whole other thing that I don't fully understand, right? Like if you asked me to rewrite Webpack right now, I'd just jump off a building. Like, I'm not doing that. I can't do that, but I can kind of understand how to use it. And that's the key. And that's why understanding the fundamentals will help you go to that next step. The next thing here is choose one stack and stick to it initially, right? So whether it be React or SvelteKit or whatever, with like Tailwind, like just choose a set of technologies to build your application in, whatever you're doing your project in, whatever you're doing your learning in, right? Like, hey, I want to learn, like, perfect example is I want to get a job. So look at your job board. A lot of people are hiring for Next.js. Learn Next.js. Deploy apps with Next.js. Learn Next.js deeply. Don't care about SvelteKit or Vue.js. Like, don't worry about those ecosystems. Don't worry about all the hundreds of libraries around those ecosystems. Only worry about Next.js, right? Like, you've learned HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Now you're focused on the next thing you need to learn to get a job. Focus on that thing. Go deep into it. Understand how to use it. Understand how it makes the web better in certain situations and stuff like that. Like, get deep into it, because once you understand it one time, once you go deep into one of these frameworks, you will already have used, like, in Next.js, you will already use stuff like Vite. You'll already use probably Tailwind. You'll already use like Node.js, because again, like I said, it's the combination of Node and stuff, of Node and React together. You already kind of go through the basic fundamental frameworks and libraries that I mentioned before, just by going down one stack. Once you need to switch out one of those, whether it be, React for Svelte or Node for Deno or some other thing for some, like, Tailwind for Sass, whatever, you'll already understand the concepts behind those things. They're all trying to solve the problem in different ways. But until you understand the problem and how it's been solved once, you won't get that. It just won't click with you. So you need to understand the problem and how it was solved once. And just that's why stick to one stack. Don't jump stacks. Just go down all the way. Even if you hear the best stack pop up,
I'd like to mention something here too, is that with these 2 points, is that like what these 2 points you just made point out is that there's always going to be an abstraction layer to things. Like if we bring it back to like my TV example of like how inputs work and like plugging in HDMI cables, this and that, like you could get super into like how does this like Samsung Smart TV work and like get into the software of it and blah, blah, blah. And you understand that plugging things into certain ports, this is input 1, this is input 2, you can get into that. But there's still some abstraction there, like, well, how does, like, what metals are we using? And like, what are the contacts? And like, there's all like the devices we make as humans now are so complex that there's always going to be some abstraction, right? Like, how did it get here? Like, what's the shipping channel? You're not going to be able to understand all that, like it sucks when there's so many things abstracted and there's so many things that not like things that you just like won't understand or don't understand or things that don't matter to you on the daily. I think that there's too many of those things in web development for sure. Like you should generally understand what's going on. Like with the TV, it's like pretty simple. You don't need to know how to code to use a TV and generally you understand what's going on. But there's obviously going to be things like, hey, I don't know how to make that printed circuit board. I don't understand the circuitry. I don't understand because these devices or even these websites are so complex that there are going to be things that, you know, other people have built for you. And you just have to sort of trust in that. I mean, I do the same thing. I'll make small to medium business websites on Webflow and things like that. I have to trust that Webflow will work. If Webflow goes down, client messages me, it's like, yo, Webflow's down. Like, that's my answer. I can't go and like remake Webflow real quick for them to, you know, continue doing what they were doing before. That's just not the case.
That's exactly it. Next thing here is build projects. When building projects, it'll matter. Like your goal there is to complete a feature. Your goal there is to complete the project, right? It's not about, hey, I need to learn all these different technologies. It's just like, how do I build this thing? And a lot of times what that'll do is it'll force you down rabbit holes to get to a certain technology that you'll have to learn, but it'll become natural. And that's, again, that's how it was for us. Like all these little things like Webpack and Tailwind, all that was a natural progression for us that turned into chaos, but it was very natural. Like, again, we reach for a thing that helps us design better. Like Tailwind, it's an easy design system. We reach for the thing that helps us optimize images easier, Webpack, right? Like we go through all these little things that only could happen if we were needing them at the time for a project. That's the only time they made sense. Again, if you're learning from it in an abstract from a 10 layers away way like you are right now on a podcast, this is all chaos and all just disaster. But when you're actually using the thing and you're just taking one tool at a time and just unpacking it a little bit and just like, okay, I need this thing from that tool. And then just like twisting the knob a little bit and then figuring it out, plugging it in, you have this much more natural progression to understanding the ecosystem as a whole. So build projects. We talk about this all the time, but in this context, it will help you understand how the developer tooling that was created is needed and when it needs to be used. Next thing here is join developer communities. Being part of the JavaScript ecosystem and the JavaScript ecosystem community will help when you have questions, obviously. And you're going to have a lot of questions. That's the reality. Like after this podcast, you're probably going to be like, where am I? But the reality is like you can, if you're part of a community, if you're part of a team, if you're part of, you know, meetups and stuff like that, you're going to have outlets for like, first of all, venting about this bullshit. It's perfectly fine to vent about the disaster that is the JavaScript ecosystem, but also just maybe enjoying parts of it. Like, hey, I found this tool. Has anyone ever used it? And then people can chime in and be like, yeah, it's shit, or yeah, it's great. I use it for this and this. And then you can like, okay, that's cool. Maybe I'll try it while I'm working on this project for this thing that I'm doing, right? Like connected back to what you're actually using it for, right? When you get to a point in a project where you don't know what to do, and you're just like, well, I might have to build this from scratch, and that might take me like, 6 months, and I don't know what to use because there's like 15 different tools. That's when you need to reach out to communities. That's when you need to connect with people and get more guidance. So without developer communities, that's going to be very difficult to do and easy to get overwhelmed. The next thing here is followed a structured learning path. So we have episodes of the podcast talking about roadmaps. Maybe we'll link a few of them. Maybe we'll create a new one soon. But a roadmap isn't a concretely defined thing that will get you a job. What it is, again, back to that, like choose a stack and stick to it. It just gives you that structure to be able to go deeper and easier without having the noise. Because if you don't have a roadmap or a learning path, it's very easy to get sidetracked by noise. Like, again, when you get to the point after CSS, JavaScript, and HTML, that's a pretty clear roadmap. And then you have, Vue, Angular, Nuxt, Next.js, SvelteKit, Sapper, Astro, Solid. I can keep going for like another 6 hours, all doing the same thing. Like, what are you going to do? So if you have a roadmap, the next step is clear. And yeah, sometimes it might be the wrong step. That's the reality. Sometimes you might be choosing the wrong technology for whatever reason. It could be that it's just not as popular. It's old, whatever. But again, going back to the, like, just sticking with it, if you understand it, even if it's old, even if it's not used that much and there's whatever, you'll be able to understand the other stuff that can go in its place when you're looking for a job. And that's really valuable. Those are kind of like the 5 things that I would say should help you from being overwhelmed. It's impossible to be completely unoverwhelmed, because this is the nature of where we're at with web development. You're going to be overwhelmed sometimes when you have choices to make, and when you're implementing something and it's throwing an error in 15 different ways. Yeah, it's going to happen, but it's possible as long as you focus on one thing at a time. You kind of keep moving forward. You have the structured learning, you build projects, you focus on the fundamentals, and you join the communities. It's very probable that you're going to get through it, and you're going to understand these pieces much better. And you're going to be the one talking to someone like us, or someone like yourself 10 years ago or 5 years ago, about the chaos that is the JavaScript.
I'd like to add an extra point for those that are self-taught, but it's based on like the default structured paths that you had mentioned. And it's that a lot of self-taught developers are going to stray away, or at least I do even to this day. I kind of try to stay away from courses or long form YouTube videos where there's basically like a large playlist, which is basically a course, a large playlist where it's like, yo, let's go through this, let's go through that, let's go through this. And I'm trying to look for like the quick fix, the quick, solution to get on to the next thing so I can continue working on whatever project I'm working on. And I think that, for self-taught developers, sometimes if you're just completely overwhelmed and you're consistently getting stuck, it's time to literally go to a structured learning path. And when I say that, it doesn't necessarily mean a structured school. I mean, go to a course, like go to a Udemy course, find a course. And it sucks, but sometimes it's like I've been roadblocked. Like, I don't understand generally what's going on here. And I can keep looking up little code snippets. I can keep asking ChatGPT to give me little code snippets. I can keep going on forums and asking about these little siloed, isolated issues. But I actually do not understand what's going on. Like, if you're learning the basics, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and you do not understand what HTML is really for, and you're just kind of getting something to generate the HTML for you, and you're only learning CSS and JavaScript, I mean, you're losing a kind of key part of the foundation, and you're not going to understand that knowledge. So when you see HTML in the future, you're going to be like, well, I know that's HTML, but I don't really understand what it's for. This was actually a really big problem when Mike and I were in college, where for some reason we weren't taught programming, but we were supposed to be programming chips. Like, we were supposed to be doing the programming on like computer chips, on electronic chips. And for anyone who did high school programming or programming on the side of any sort, it was pretty easy programming. Like, programming chips is like, turn that on, turn that off, turn whatever. But there was a lot of people in our class, and not to their fault, that they didn't understand this. Like, they don't understand how to think like a computer. They don't understand conditional statements. They don't understand those basics. And so we pushed and fought and everything else to try to get, a programming course added to our program, because it was like, hey, we're really struggling with this. The people that are going to come into this later are also probably going to struggle. And it was one of the courses with one of the lower grades, because it was like, yo, like, people are missing a key bit here. I understand that maybe it's only going to take 1 to 5 classes, depending on how in depth they are, 1 to 5 programming classes for them to understand programming enough, understand computational logic enough to then do this other thing. But at the very least, there needs to be some lessons then. But it was just sort of like, all right, program this. And some people are like, what's programming? Because we were doing circuits, we were doing electricity, we were doing those type of things. And we were doing a little bit of computational logic, but we were doing it with physical chips and gates. We were doing Boolean algebra on paper, those type of things. And you're missing that sort of key fundamental, this is what this is. So if you're at that point, but with web development, where you're just like, I keep getting stuck, I don't know what I'm doing. Or if you've just jumped into React or jumped into Vue or something, and you're just like, I do not know what's going on here. I just keep, slogging through, but I really would benefit time-wise, or even audit yourself and go, yo, if I understood what this was, I could probably even ask the questions better, but I'm probably not even asking the questions well. So getting my questions answered on forums and communities, or just from ChatGPT or Google, I'm actually struggling to even do that. There comes a point when it's like, I need a structured learning path, to the point where I actually need to do a course. I need to kind of pull back the layers and go, all right, I'm in Vue right now. I need a Vue Udemy course. maybe you do want to go to traditional school or something. It's up to you. You choose your path. But sometimes the path is not always, hey, I'm just going to keep struggling on my own roadmap. It's like, no, identify what you're struggling with and look at the quote unquote roadmap, more specifically the course that someone has made. And then you're like, hey, I want to make a slider in Vue. This person's making a slider review. It's a 10-part playlist. I'm going to sit down and do this. Hey, I'm still really confused. Okay, I'm drawing it back again. Pull back that layer. I want to do an actual Vue course. I'm still confused. I got to draw it back again. I'm going to go to do a JavaScript course. That's serious. Like, I'm 100% serious. And it sucks. It sucks to have to go back. We've done it. Mike and I have done it in college, in different other things other than web development, and in web development as well, in our professional work. Absolutely. Sometimes we have to slog it out to hit a deadline, but then you're like, I got to go back. Like, Mike, I remember you were talking one time where you were trying to slog it out with something. I forget what it was. Might have been Electron or something. And then you were just like, I can't, like, this is just stupid. Like, I'm not going to be able to do this. Like, I need to take a course on how to do this. And I think that happened a couple of times. You were doing some sort of web development, and then there was some like Android native that needed to be written. And so you went and did a course, and then you ended up just telling them like, yo, like, this is going to take me so long to like get acquainted with all the different versions of Android, the different hardware, whatever. I think we should like have me focus on this other area, like the web development stuff. And then we should have someone else, like an Android developer, come in, because they're going to do it in like 3 days. We're going to tell them, yo, I need this really simple thing to interact with my code. It's going to be 3 days rather than you learning it for 25 days, right? And that was because you peeled back the layers, you went back, you looked at the courses, you looked at a YouTube playlist, whatever it was, and then you just said, okay, you know what, like, this isn't feasible. Or with the Electron, I don't, correct me if I'm wrong if it was Electron, but you were like, this is feasible, I can do this. I just needed to have a bit of, I needed to understand what the heck was going on. Now I understand what's going on. Now I can proceed.
So I've done that like probably a dozen times at least, where I hit a roadblock enough where I'm just like, okay, I don't understand the concepts here. I need to go back and get the concepts. And that happened with Vue.js, that happened with Cordova, that happened with Android development, like you mentioned, that happened with, those are the top 3 that I can remember right now. But anyway, it happened a lot. Like it's happened a lot. And that's very, very good advice. When you hit a roadblock and you get frustrated that you can't get that next step, that's a very good indicator for you that you need to go back and understand the fundamentals a little bit more of whatever you're doing. And peeling back the layers is also a very key method to getting to the point where you start understanding. Obviously start at the top layer first so that you're not going back too far, but if you need to go back far, that's the way to learn. Don't get demoralized. Everyone does that. If you can do that, means you're on the right path.
Yeah. And I think, honestly, like, unless you have anything else to add, Mike, I think that's it. Those are the closing notes for this episode. Do you have anything else to add before we run up the old conclusion?
Absolutely not. Runner up.
Alrighty. Well, remember that if you want to learn from episodes like this, support episodes like this, you can do so on Patreon. That is patreon.com/HTML, all the things. And many thanks to our $3 tier patrons: Tim from the Web Hacker on thewebhacker.com, Jason from Geek Life Radio via geekliferadio.com, Garrett Segal, Level Up Financial Planning via www.levelupfinancialplanning.com, Joshua via silvio.us, and Magnus from YesWeb via yesweb.se. And last but not least, we'd like to give a shout out to Michael Larocca, a contributing author on HTMLallthethings.com. Michael is the author of Self-Taught, the X Generation blog at selftaughttxg.com. Feel free to leave a comment or a review on the platform that you are listening to this on, and this outro will sign us off.
You've been listening to HTML All the Things Podcast. Web development, web design, and small business. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show. And we hope you appreciate that we talk to you like human beings. And we hope you had some fun. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit us up on social media. On Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon at HTML All the Things. And on Twitter at HTML Everything. Until next time, this is HTML All the Things, signing off.